Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we'll be setting sail, quietly, gently, and probably in the wrong direction, into one of the chilliest chapters of human chaos, the Viking Age. So pull your blanket close, dim the lights, and let your imagination drift toward the northern seas. That endless blue-gray expanse where men wore wool, smelled like fish, and thought a good time meant paddling for 3 weeks straight to yell at strangers in foreign languages. The Vikings were not born villains or heroes. They were people who simply looked around at the frozen tundra of Scandinavia and thought, you know what this place is missing? Other people's gold. It's the same energy you get when your Wi-Fi goes out and you decide to reorganize your life. Except their version involved axes, longboats, and a surprising amount of poetry. Let's set the scene. It's the late 700s. Europe is sleepy. The Roman Empire has fallen, the monasteries are humming quietly, and people have started to forget what adventure feels like. Meanwhile, up north, the winters stretch endlessly, the nights feel longer than most marriages, and the ocean never stops whispering, what if you just rode somewhere warmer? And that's exactly what they did. They built sleek wooden ships that could slice through waves like a butter knife through slightly frozen cheese. They painted dragons on the prows, not because they believed in dragons, but because intimidation is half the battle, and because dragons look way cooler than, say, a seagull. But before we jump into the raids, the glory and the rivers of Europe trembling at the sound of distant oars, let's understand who these people actually were. They weren't an army. There was no Viking nation, no single king giving orders. The word Viking wasn't even a nationality. It was more like a job description, the medieval version of freelancer. Some farmed, some traded, some built boats, and some went Viking, which basically meant going on a business trip with a small chance of decapitation. And here's the funny thing. The first Vikings to sail weren't thinking about empire or conquest. They were thinking, we heard monks in England keep gold in boxes and don't fight back. That's not imperial ambition. That's solid market research. So tonight, as we row quietly into their story, imagine the sound of waves tapping against the hull, the distant cry of seabirds, and the rhythmic creak of oars moving in unison. Breathe slow. Let the sea air fill your mind. You're drifting toward a time of salt, smoke, and superstition, where courage smelled like sweat and destiny wore fur. And as your eyes grow heavy, remember, every civilization's bedtime story begins the same way. Someone got bored, built a boat, and forgot to come home. Chapter 2. The North awakens, far in the north, past the misty fjords and the forests thick with pine and legend. People learned to survive on stubbornness alone. In winter, the sun barely rose. The world became blue, silent, and slow. The air hurt your face. The sheep froze mid-bleat. The ale froze mid-mug. So the people of the North did what bored, cold humans have always done. They dreamed of elsewhere. They were farmers, blacksmiths, herders, and storytellers. Their nights stretched endlessly, and around the fire they spun tales of gods who wrestled giants, of heroes who crossed oceans, of worlds that ended and began again. Mythology wasn't just entertainment. It was survival. When the wind screamed through the mountains, it helped to imagine it was Thor's hammer striking down the sky, not just another miserable Tuesday. As spring returned, so did the restlessness. Frozen rivers cracked open, revealing trade routes. Birds returned, carrying gossip from the south. Stories of soft lands, fat livestock, and towns that slept with their doors unlocked. To the Vikings, this sounded less like geography and more like opportunity. Let's be honest, Scandinavia was beautiful, but it wasn't generous. The soil was thin, the seasons brief, and your odds of a good harvest were about the same as finding a warm toilet seat in January. So they built boats. Always boats. From the forests they carved their future. Planks of oak, ribs of pine, stitched together with tar and ambition. Every village had its shipwright, and every ship carried a dream. Sometimes trade, sometimes terror, often both. But before they became Europe's nightmare, the Vikings were surprisingly domestic. They cared for their families, crafted jewelry, brewed ale, and practiced excellent beard maintenance. They weren't brutes, just practical people with a healthy disregard for borders and property rights. And slowly, the North began to awaken. Villages along the coast grew busier. Traders set out across the Baltic, swapping furs and iron for silver and silk. Others followed, bringing swords instead of goods. It's said the first raiders weren't soldiers, just merchants who got tired of negotiating. Then came Lindisfarne, a quiet monastery far from trouble sitting peacefully on the English coast. Its monks prayed, wrote Latin, and fed their chickens. Until one morning in 793, a sound rose from the sea. Oars slapping water, voices shouting in a language no one recognized. The Vikings had arrived, and for the monks, the apocalypse wore wool and smelled faintly of fish oil. The raid shocked Europe, but for the North, it was only the beginning, the first spark of a new age. The fjords echoed with tales of glory and gold, and soon every young man with an axe and no patience for farming wanted to go a Viking. Still, remember this. They didn't think of themselves as conquerors. They were explorers, opportunists, dreamers of open water. They weren't trying to destroy Europe. They were trying to join it, on their own very loud terms. So as we drift further into this story, picture those longboats gliding through the dawn mist, their sails catching pale sunlight. The world is waking up, and with it, an entire civilization stretching its arms, yawning, and saying, "All right, whose monastery are we visiting next?" Chapter 3. The Recipe for a Viking. If you ever wondered how to make a Viking, the recipe was fairly simple, but not recommended for beginners. First, take one endless winter. Add hunger, boredom, and the faint but constant sound of howling wind. Stir in a sense of destiny and a deep distrust of comfort. Then season generously with mead, mythology, and mild body odor. Vikings weren't born warriors. They were assembled by climate and circumstance. Childhood in the North was a full-contact sport. If you survived frostbite, hunger, and the occasional angry reindeer, you had already earned your warrior license. Boys learned to throw axes before they could spell their names, and girls were taught to manage farms, ships, and husbands, usually in that order. The Viking household was its own small kingdom. Longhouses stretched across valleys like sleeping beasts, filled with smoke, laughter, and that distinct aroma of damp wool and ambition. Families huddled around fires, sharing stew, gossip, and legends. They didn't have Netflix, but they did have skalds. Storytellers who could turn any fishing trip into a saga of heroism and very dramatic weather. These stories mattered. When your world is mostly gray sky and freezing mud, you need meaning. Something to make the daily grind feel divine. So they believed in Odin, the one-eyed wanderer who traded an eyeball for wisdom, in Thor, who used lightning as anger management, in Freya, who managed love and war like a multitasking goddess on her third cup of morning ale. And at the heart of their belief was Valhalla, the ultimate motivational poster. Die bravely, and you get an eternal afterlife of feasting, fighting, and free refills. Die cowardly, and well, you don't get an invite. It was a system that encouraged heroics and discouraged hiding under your shield. But there was more to the Viking spirit than just blood and thunder. They were surprisingly poetic. Many could carve runes, sing sagas, and compose verses that rhymed axe with destiny. Their language was rich, sharp, and full of rhythm, like the sea itself, and they were practical. Weapons doubled as tools, ships doubled as homes, and marriage doubled as an alliance treaty with occasional romantic benefits. A Viking wedding wasn't about love. It was about property lines and strong calves. But there was affection too, expressed mostly through gifts of fur and the occasional rescued chicken. Even humor was weaponized. They mocked enemies, kings, and even their gods, because laughter, like a good sword, could cut through fear. One saga tells of a warrior who, when facing certain death, declared, "At least I'll finally get warm." That's Viking optimism, cold, dark, and somehow comforting. But perhaps the secret ingredient was curiosity. They were restless souls, forever staring at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond the fog. While others prayed for safety, Vikings prayed for wind, the kind that carried ships toward the unknown. Adventure wasn't a choice. It was a compulsion, an ache in the bones that no amount of beer could soothe. And so, generation by generation, the recipe continued. Take hardship, add courage, mix with humor, and bake slowly under a pale northern sun. Out came a people ready to change the map of Europe. Not because they wanted to rule the world, but because they were tired of looking at snow. Chapter 4. Boats, beards, and bad decisions. No Viking story can begin without their most powerful creation, the longship. It was sleek, symmetrical, and terrifying. A masterpiece of wood, sweat, and unregulated maritime engineering. These ships could glide across oceans, slip up shallow rivers, and beach on shorelines like a wooden shark. A typical longship was around 25 meters long and could carry 40 to 60 men, all rowing in rhythm, half chanting, half regretting their life choices. The planks were overlapped like fish scales, making the hull flexible enough to handle the wild northern seas. The sail was usually striped red and white, the medieval equivalent of saying, "We came to party." Building one took months of labor, gallons of tar, and an unreasonable number of trees. But when finished, it was more than transport. It was identity. Each ship had a name, like Sea Serpent or Wave Crusher, because shouting "row, unnamed vessel" simply didn't inspire the same fear. The front of the ship often bore a dragon's head, carved with teeth and fury. To the Vikings, it scared away evil spirits. To the locals watching it approach, it scared away sleep. And the back of the ship? Usually filled with supplies, spare oars, and men pretending not to be seasick. Life aboard a longship was unpleasant. There were no bathrooms, no privacy, and only the faint hope that the wind wouldn't blow directly from the rear row. The sea spray soaked everything, and meals consisted mostly of dried fish, hard bread, and prayers. But despite the misery, the Vikings loved it. The ship was freedom, a floating promise that life could be more than mud and taxes. They navigated using the stars, the sun, and occasionally pure guesswork. Some historians believe they used sunstones, crystals that could locate the sun through clouds, proving they were both superstitious and surprisingly scientific. Others say they just followed birds until they hit land or regret. Either way, it worked. Once a crew set sail, the atmosphere was a mix of camaraderie and chaos. They sang rowing songs, told dirty jokes, and probably argued about whose turn it was to patch the leak. Discipline was simple. If you didn't row, you swam. And then came landfall, the moment when distant shorelines appeared through mist, and the promise of loot glimmered on the horizon. The Vikings would lower their sail, lift their oars, and glide silently toward the beach like ghosts. Then, and only then, came the shouting, the thunder of boots, and the sound of terrified locals realizing today was not going to plan. But not every voyage ended in plunder. Some ships were lost to storms, others to bad luck, and many to pure navigation errors. Imagine sailing for weeks, expecting Paris, and ending up in a swamp full of confused frogs. Still, they pressed on, because the sea, like life, offered no guarantees except the next wave. And so, boat by boat, bay by bay, the Vikings began to stretch their reach. From the icy fjords to the coasts of Britain, from the rivers of France to the plains of Russia, wherever a river flowed, a longship could follow. They weren't just raiders anymore. They were explorers, merchants, settlers, and storytellers. But for now, imagine the scene at night. A dozen longships anchored quietly off a foreign coast. The men huddled under firs, the stars flicker above, and the water laps gently against the hull. Someone snores. Someone sharpens an axe. Someone whispers a prayer to Odin, asking for calm seas and generous enemies. And beneath the rhythmic rocking of the waves, you can almost hear the heartbeat of an age awakening, steady, unstoppable, and beautifully absurd. Chapter 5. The first business trip. It started, as many questionable adventures do, with a simple idea. Let's go see what's over there, and maybe take some of it home. The first recorded Viking raid wasn't a grand invasion or a master plan. It was curiosity with a side of chaos. The year was 793, and the target was a quiet little island off the English coast called Lindisfarne. Now, Lindisfarne was not a fortress. It was a monastery, full of monks, manuscripts, and very shiny religious objects. The kind of place that said peace and love, not armed defense. The monks had dedicated their lives to prayer, fasting, and hoping no one would ever show up with axes. And then, one misty morning, they heard it. The rhythmic slap of oars, the creak of wood, the low hum of voices carried on sea wind. At first, they might have thought it was traders, maybe even visitors seeking God. But as the longships appeared through the fog, carved with dragons and bristling with shields, divine intervention seemed increasingly unlikely. The Vikings landed fast, loud, and utterly unapologetic. They stormed the beach, kicked open doors, and treated the monastery like a medieval Black Friday sale. Gold chalices, taken. Silver crosses, taken. Monks, screaming. No one was prepared. The idea that anyone could sail from the far north across such dangerous seas just to rob a church was unthinkable. But that's the thing about human history. The moment someone says no one would ever do that, a Viking hears it as a personal challenge. When word of Lindisfarne spread across Europe, panic followed. Kings called it the wrath of God. Priests described it as the end of days, but the Vikings called it something else: a successful business trip. Back home in Scandinavia, the returning crew was greeted like heroes. They came back not just with treasure, but with stories. Tales of easy targets, rich lands, and people too polite to fight back. Soon, every ambitious young man from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden wanted to try his luck. The fjords echoed with hammering, shouting, and the smell of freshly tarred ships. It was the dawn of an era, not just of violence, but of adventure. For the Vikings, Lindisfarne wasn't just a raid. It was proof. Proof that the world was larger than their maps, and that fortune favored those with sturdy boats and a flexible moral compass. And so they set out again. To Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man, every coastline was an invitation, every river a new road. Some came home rich, others didn't come home at all. But for centuries afterward, the world would whisper the same word, Viking, with a mix of awe, fear, and reluctant respect. And somewhere, in that quiet northern night, a storyteller probably sat by the fire and began, "Did I ever tell you about the time we visited England? Lovely place. Bit screamier than expected." Chapter 6, Europe's Wake-Up Call. The raid on Lindisfarne was Europe's alarm clock, and it did not come with a snooze button. News of the attack spread like spilled ale across the continent. Monks trembled. Kings doubled their guards. Even the Pope reportedly sighed and muttered something like, "Here we go again." But the truth was, no one understood what they were dealing with. The Vikings didn't march like armies or negotiate like diplomats. They came from the sea, vanished into rivers, and appeared again 100 miles inland, fast, furious, and frustratingly efficient. They didn't follow the rules of war. They didn't care about treaties, religion, or the traditional working hours of 9 to 5 pillaging. They could strike anywhere, anytime, and leave before the local soldiers finished tightening their sandals. To the terrified villagers of Europe, they were demons. To the Vikings, they were simply on the clock. And Europe had no plan. Defenses were weak, armies were small, and communication was slower than a snail with a limp. By the time someone sent word to the king, the Vikings were already halfway home, counting loot, singing songs, and laughing about how easy it all was. The English coasts were the first to crumble. Then came Ireland, Scotland, and the northern coasts of France. The great rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, became Viking highways. There, longships slid silently through the mist, rowing right up to rich towns and monasteries that thought they were safe inland. Imagine it. You're a French monk writing a psalm, when suddenly 40 enormous men burst through the door demanding your silver candlesticks. You'd probably forget the Latin for help. For decades, this pattern repeated: raid, burn, leave. And the worst part? They kept coming back. The same towns were raided so often that some monks just left signs outside reading, "Already looted. Try next door." Europe had never seen mobility like this. The Vikings didn't just conquer, they traveled. Their reach extended from Spain to Russia, from Iceland to Italy. They explored, traded, and raided in the same breath, proving that chaos could also be a business model. But there was something strangely admirable about them. They weren't driven by hatred or ideology, only opportunity. They didn't want to destroy civilization. They wanted to join it, preferably by kicking down the front door first. Eventually, some began to stay. They built winter camps, then small villages, then permanent settlements. They intermarried, learned languages, traded goods, and, to everyone's surprise, became rather polite once they stopped hitting people. Europe, meanwhile, was forced to adapt. Fortresses grew stronger, towns built walls, and coastal lookouts became the medieval version of security cameras. Kings started to unify smaller regions under stronger crowns, in part, just to afford better guards. In a strange way, the Vikings accidentally helped Europe grow up. Still, for now, the raids continued, relentless, profitable, and oddly well-organized for men who couldn't write down directions. So if you ever find yourself drifting off tonight, imagine the scene. A quiet monastery, a silver moon, and far in the distance, the faint rhythm of oars against the sea, the sound of Europe realizing it's about to have a very long century. Chapter 7. The Economics of Raiding to the Vikings. Raiding wasn't just violence, it was economics with extra rowing. They didn't have stock markets or quarterly reports. Their economy was powered by courage, oak, and the occasional terrified monk. Gold and silver were useful, sure, but prestige was the real currency. Coming home empty-handed meant shame. Coming home with treasure meant your neighbors would pretend not to notice how much you smelled. The richer you got, the more people wanted to join your crew, or at least borrow your boat. The Viking world was surprisingly businesslike beneath all the screaming. They scouted targets, planned routes, and built supply chains that stretched across seas. Each crew had investors, wealthy chieftains who funded voyages in exchange for a share of the loot. It was the medieval equivalent of a startup, except instead of pitching ideas to venture capitalists, you pitched axes at monks. Their raids weren't random. They followed trade winds and whispers of weak defenses. A smart leader didn't just want gold, he wanted information. Who was rich, who was unguarded, who had a nice church but a small army. And once they found such a place, they arrived like accountants of doom, balancing ledgers with fire. Loot came in all forms: coins, chalices, cattle, jewelry, even people. Slaves, or thralls as they called them, became one of the North's biggest exports. Captured villagers were sold across Scandinavia, used in households, or traded further east to merchants in the Islamic world. It was grim business, but in the Viking mind, it was simply part of the cycle of survival. Back home, the spoils of raids flowed into local economies. Gold bought ships, ships created jobs, jobs built communities. A kind of Nordic trickle-down effect powered by fear. Some wealth went to building temples, longhouses, and mead halls, places to feast, tell stories, and remind everyone who had the nicest axes. But wealth also fueled transformation. With more resources came trade, with trade came diplomacy, and with diplomacy came slightly fewer raids. The Vikings discovered that you could make money without necessarily lighting something on fire, though many still preferred the old way for nostalgia's sake. Their markets became lively crossroads. Amber, walrus ivory, and furs from the north were exchanged for silk, spices, and silver from the south. They built towns like Hedeby and Birka, where traders from across Europe met under flags of uneasy friendship. A Viking merchant might sell you fine leather one week and rob your cousin the next. Diversification was key. And through it all, a new type of Viking emerged. Less raider, more entrepreneur. They learned foreign tongues, adopted new customs, and sometimes even converted religions if it meant better deals. It turns out that behind every screaming warrior was a surprisingly good salesman. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a Viking counting coins by candlelight. The faint creak of timber, the scent of sea salt and smoke. His axe lies beside him just in case, but his mind is elsewhere, already planning the next voyage, the next investment, the next empire of opportunity. Because even in the dark ages, someone always found a way to monetize adventure. Chapter 8. A Day in the Life of a Raider. Let's pause from the legends for a moment and peek into a typical day aboard a Viking raid. Spoiler. It wasn't glamorous, it was wet, cold, loud, and smelled like determination marinated in seawater. The crew usually woke before dawn, though no one ever really slept on a longship. You'd stretch your aching limbs, wipe the frost from your beard, and check that the guy next to you hadn't rolled overboard. Breakfast was dried fish or flatbread, the medieval version of a protein bar. Then came rowing, always rowing. Hours of rhythmic motion, muscles burning, oars creaking in unison. The ship's leader, a steersman or jarl, shouted orders over the wind. Some sang rowing songs to keep pace, deep booming chants that echoed across the water. Imagine 40 voices chanting about Odin's beard and overdue debts. Not quite lullaby material, but hypnotic all the same. When the wind was good, they hoisted the sail. The ship tilted, the ropes groaned, and the ocean stretched endlessly ahead. Sometimes dolphins followed, sometimes storms did. If the sea turned violent, the crew bailed water with helmets and swore creatively. Hygiene was minimal. They washed in the rain, shaved with knives, and brushed their hair with bone combs they kept tucked in their belts. To a monk, they looked like wild beasts. To each other, they looked fabulous. When land appeared, excitement rippled through the ship. They'd glide toward the coast, spears ready, nerves buzzing. No drums or trumpets. Stealth was part of the thrill. The first sound most victims heard was the crunch of boots on sand. Raiding itself was swift and terrifying. They hit villages, monasteries, and ports, anywhere with silver or livestock. Houses burned, alarms rang, and within an hour, they were back on their ships, leaving smoke and confusion behind. But between raids, life was surprisingly ordinary. They mended sails, played dice, told jokes, and shared stories. Some carved runes into bits of wood, leaving behind tiny graffiti, names, prayers, or drawings of ships. Even raiders, it turns out, doodled when bored. At night, the mood softened. Fires flickered on the beach, mead was passed around, and the tension of battle gave way to laughter. They told tales of gods and ghosts, of home and hearth, of lovers waiting by the fjords. The stars stretched endlessly above, cold and distant. The same stars their ancestors had followed for centuries. Occasionally, a man would wander to the edge of the camp, stare at the waves, and whisper something only the sea could hear. For all their ferocity, many Vikings carried a strange melancholy, a longing for meaning beyond gold and glory. They were wanderers in every sense, fierce in body, restless in soul. And so the cycle repeated: sail, raid, feast, sleep. Weeks turned to months, and the sea became both home and prison. Some never returned, swallowed by storms or arrows. Others came back older, richer, and slightly deaf from all the shouting. But whether alive or lost, they all shared one thing: the pull of the horizon. That endless question, what's next? It's what drove them onward, from coast to coast, until the whole of Europe knew their name. And tonight, as the waves whisper outside your window, real or imagined, you can almost hear it too. That low, steady rhythm of oars, the hum of courage and curiosity intertwined. A reminder that even in an age of darkness, some people looked out at the sea and saw adventure. Chapter 9. Gods, Gold, and Getting Home Alive. If you want to understand the Viking mind, you need to meet their gods, a chaotic pantheon of warriors, tricksters, and bad decision-makers. Where other civilizations had serene deities who embodied peace and wisdom, the Norse gods were like a family reunion where everyone brought an axe. Odin, the All-Father, was their king, a one-eyed wanderer who sacrificed his own eye for knowledge. Imagine being so curious, you give up depth perception for wisdom. He ruled from his hall in Asgard, watched over the world with ravens, and occasionally disguised himself as a drifter just to test people's hospitality, the divine equivalent of showing up uninvited to dinner. Then there was Thor, not the Hollywood version, but the real one. Red-bearded, loud, short-tempered, and constantly hitting things with his hammer, Mjolnir. He was the god of thunder, farmers, and anyone who felt smashing problems was a valid life strategy. Sailors prayed to him for good weather. Warriors prayed for his strength. Blacksmiths just admired his work ethic. And of course, Loki, the shape-shifting trickster. He wasn't evil exactly, just inconvenient. The Norse version of that one friend who always starts chaos for the vibes. Sometimes he helped the gods. Sometimes he ruined everything. But he always made the story more entertaining. And isn't that what bedtime is for? For Vikings, these myths weren't distant legends. They were woven into daily life. Before setting sail, warriors touched their amulets, murmuring small prayers to Odin or Thor. Before battle, they smeared their faces with ash, whispered chants, and asked the gods to notice them, hopefully in a good way. Their religion wasn't about perfection. It was about participation. Life was unpredictable, so the gods were too. If the sea swallowed your ship, maybe Aegir, god of the ocean, was in a bad mood. If your crops failed, perhaps Freyr wanted a goat. It was a world of bargaining, offerings, and occasional bribes to supernatural forces who probably weren't keeping score. And then there was Valhalla, the Viking heaven. A glorious mead hall where warriors who died bravely would feast, fight, and nap forever. Every day they'd rise, battle each other for fun, then heal instantly and eat roast boar while listening to poetry. It was the ultimate after-party for people who thought eternal rest sounded boring. But here's the catch. You had to die well. If you slipped on ice or tripped on your sword, no Valhalla for you. Instead, you'd end up in hell, not the fiery pit of Christian myth, but a cold, dreary underworld ruled by a goddess who looked like she'd been awake since last Tuesday. This worldview shaped everything. When a Viking faced danger, he didn't pray to survive. He prayed to make it epic. Fear was replaced by fatalism. If your fate was already woven by the Norns, those mysterious goddesses of destiny, why not charge headfirst into glory? And perhaps that's what made them unstoppable. Their faith wasn't gentle. It was daring. It gave meaning to risk, humor to hardship, and poetry to pain. Imagine it now, the creak of a longship at night, the stars reflecting in cold, black water. A warrior stares into the sea, his fingers brushing a small hammer pendant around his neck. He whispers a prayer not for safety, but for a story worth retelling. And somewhere above, perhaps the gods lean over the clouds, half smiling, half bored, deciding who will live to see another dawn. Chapter 10. The Great Heathen Army Now Hiring. By the mid-800s, Europe had gotten used to small Viking raids, annoying, yes, but manageable. Then came the year 865, and with it, a memo no one wanted to read. The great heathen army is coming. This was no quick hit and run. It was a full-scale invasion, thousands of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and beyond, uniting under legendary leaders with names that sound like heavy metal album titles: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. Ivar the Boneless was the strangest of them all. No one knows exactly why he was boneless. Some say he had a condition that made his legs weak. Others say it was a poetic nickname, like Slim Shady, but with more murder. Either way, he was brilliant, a strategist, a negotiator, and a man who could terrify enemies while seated. The great heathen army landed in East Anglia, England, where the locals had the bad luck of being both polite and unprepared. Instead of leaving after the usual plunder, the Vikings stayed. They took winter quarters, demanded supplies, and used the cold months to sharpen their swords and their real estate ambitions. Over the next decade, they marched across England like a slow-moving thunderstorm. Northumbria fell, Mercia fell. Even mighty York, one of Rome's old cities, became Viking territory. Each victory fed the next, and soon England was less a kingdom and more a buffet. But this wasn't just about violence. The great heathen army was also a migration. Families, craftsmen, and traders following behind the warriors. Wherever they went, they built houses, markets, and sometimes friendships with locals who decided that resisting them was overrated. England began to change. Old Saxon laws blended with Norse customs. New words entered the language: law, sky, egg, husband, all Viking imports, proving that even invaders bring vocabulary. Some Vikings settled down for good. They married locals, raised children, and forgot which side of the sea their ancestors had come from. What started as conquest slowly turned into colonization, one long raid that never really ended. Meanwhile, European rulers scrambled. They built forts, negotiated ransoms, and occasionally tried diplomacy, which usually went like this: King, please leave. Viking, how much for that monastery? But even as the great heathen army raged across the land, not all Vikings were united. Old rivalries simmered. Ambition sparked betrayals. Leaders came and went, some slain in battle, others in their sleep, all eventually sung about in sagas that blurred fact and fantasy. By the 870s, England's last free kingdom, Wessex, stood its ground under King Alfred the Great, a patient man with the soul of a librarian and the temper of a saint. Alfred used strategy, fortified towns, and maybe divine caffeine to outlast them. After years of back-and-forth fighting, he negotiated a truce, creating the Danelaw, the section of England ruled by Vikings under their own laws. The great heathen army, exhausted and rich, eventually fragmented. Some returned home, others stayed, and though the campaign ended, its legacy didn't. The Viking Age had proven something terrifyingly simple: Europe was conquerable. Still, if you listen closely to the sagas, there's always humor buried in the horror. Songs about the boneless one outsmarting kings. Tales of warriors stealing cheese from monasteries. History may remember the blood, but the Vikings remembered the banter. So as you settle deeper into sleep, imagine the flicker of firelight over a camp filled with tents and laughter. Axes rest beside shields. The air smells of smoke and ambition. Somewhere, a storyteller begins. Once upon a time, a man with no bones conquered half of England. And the night, as always, listens. Chapter 11. The British Isles, all-you-can-raid buffet. After Lindisfarne and the great heathen army, The Vikings had discovered something wonderful. The British Isles were basically an all-you-can-raid buffet. Dozens of kingdoms, endless coastlines, and weather just bad enough to make everyone too tired to fight back. The raids kept coming like unwanted party guests. They struck from the sea, the rivers, even inland, sailing right up people's living rooms, shouting, "Surprise!" in Old Norse. By the early 800s, it seemed that every monastery from Cornwall to the Hebrides had its own personalized Viking horror story. But not all raids were random. The Norsemen were learning patterns. Where the tides ran, when the monks were praying, which abbeys had the best silver candlesticks. They were the first data-driven invaders, less emotional, more spreadsheet. And they started leaving fewer burning ruins and more settlements. Yes, the same people who once saw England as a snack began to see it as home. They built villages, married locals, and learned that rainy weather is easier to tolerate when you own the farm. Towns like York became thriving Viking hubs, full of traders, artisans, and people loudly insisting they weren't raiders anymore, just opportunistic importers. The English language absorbed their presence like a sponge. Everyday words, sky, egg, knife, law, window, all come from Old Norse. Imagine the conversations. "Nice farm." "Thanks, it's our farm now." And centuries later, those words still linger, polite little souvenirs of past invasions. Not every encounter was friendly, of course. There were battles, betrayals, and enough grudges to fuel an entire season of historical soap opera. But over time, the line between Viking and Saxon blurred. Children grew up bilingual, feasting on mead and porridge, half chanting Norse sagas, half mumbling psalms. Meanwhile, the islands themselves changed shape, politically and literally. Kingdoms merged for protection, fortresses rose along rivers. The people of Wessex built burhs, fortified towns where farmers could run when someone shouted, "The Norse are coming!" It was medieval urban planning powered by panic. Yet strangely, trade blossomed. Viking merchants filled markets with furs, amber, and stories. Ships carried goods instead of soldiers, most of the time. England's towns grew richer, even as they prayed for fewer visitors. By the late 800s, Viking rule covered vast swaths of northern England. The Danelaw stretched from coast to coast, not a single kingdom, but a loose confederation of settlements governed by Norse customs. Law, taxes, and beer, all handled with characteristic efficiency and occasional axe-based enforcement. And still, they kept exploring. Some sailed west to Ireland, where they founded cities like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, places that started as raider camps and ended as trade hubs. Irish monks wrote about them in tones of equal horror and fascination, noting that the invaders had better ships, cleaner clothes, and annoyingly, great cheekbones. For 2 centuries, the British Isles pulsed with Norse influence. It was messy, loud, and utterly transformative. From Yorkshire to the Orkneys, from Dublin to the Isle of Man, the Vikings left their fingerprints on language, law, and legend. And perhaps, as they stood on some misty hill overlooking the sea, a few even thought, "This isn't so bad. The sheep are friendly." As night falls on our story, picture the shores of the north. Torches flickering, waves whispering against the rocks, distant laughter in the dark. The raiders have become neighbors, and for a brief, strange moment, the British Isles belong to both. To the sword and the plough, the cross and the hammer, the old gods and the new. Chapter 12. France gets a surprise visit. While the British Isles were busy negotiating whose turn it was to get raided, France, or rather the patchwork of kingdoms that would become France, thought it was safe. After all, they had castles, knights, and croissants. What could possibly go wrong? Enter the Vikings. They had discovered the rivers of France, wide, gentle, and tragically convenient. The Seine, Loire, and Garonne became watery highways leading straight into the soft, buttery center of the Frankish world. Paris, Rouen, Nantes, all within rowing distance. In 845, a fleet of longships under the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, yes, that Ragnar, sailed up the Seine with about 120 ships. Imagine the scene. Parisians waking up, stretching, and saying, "Ah, what a peaceful morning," as 100 dragon-proud ships glide into view. Breakfast was cancelled. The city panicked. King Charles the Bald, a name that sounds like an insult disguised as genealogy, gathered troops, prayed, and probably reconsidered every life decision. But the Vikings didn't want a long war. They wanted cash. They camped outside Paris, threatened to burn everything, and politely requested 7,000 pounds of silver not to do so. France invented the protection fee that day, centuries before the mafia perfected it. The deal worked. The Vikings got paid, packed up, and left, only to return a few years later because, shockingly, paying them once did not discourage repeat visits. France became their favorite vacation spot. Beautiful rivers, decent wine, and locals who kept restocking the silver. Over time, though, something shifted. The Franks realized they couldn't stop the raids, but maybe they could redirect them. They began offering land instead of money. Please just settle somewhere and stop burning Paris. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, if you can't beat them, hire them. And so, the Duchy of Normandy was born. In 911, the Viking leader Rollo, towering, stubborn, and perpetually hungry, made a deal with King Charles the Simple. In exchange for peace, Rollo would defend the region from other Vikings and, minor detail, convert to Christianity. Rollo agreed. The king exhaled. Paris finally stopped smoking. Rollo's descendants would become the Normans, still fierce, still ambitious, but now dressed respectably and attending church. They spoke French, adopted chivalry, and pretended they didn't used to raid people for fun. A few generations later, their great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, would invade England in 1066, proving that family traditions die hard. Meanwhile, back in Scandinavia, people began to hear stories of their cousins living comfortably in France. No frostbite, no starving goats, plenty of bread. Many followed, turning raiders into settlers and settlers into landlords. France, unwillingly, became a laboratory for Viking evolution. From savages to nobles, from torchbearers to tax collectors. The transformation was complete. But beneath the new manners, the old instincts lingered. You can put a Viking in silk, but he'll still check the coastline for raid potential. As the night deepens, picture the Seine under moonlight. Silver ripples, soft laughter, a faint echo of oars. Somewhere on the bank, a watchman peers into the mist and mutters, "Not again." History repeats itself, quietly, rhythmically, like the sea. Chapter 13. Scandinavia, home but not peaceful. While the rest of Europe was busy building churches, paying ransoms, and recovering from Viking-induced stress, things back in Scandinavia were complicated. You might think that, with all the gold flowing in, the homeland would have been peaceful, a cozy paradise of content warriors sipping mead and writing poetry. Not quite. The Vikings had conquered half the continent, but couldn't stop fighting each other at home. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden weren't united kingdoms. They were a patchwork of clans, petty kings, and ambitious jarls, each convinced Odin personally liked them best. Every fjord had its own ruler, every valley its own grudges. Alliances formed and dissolved faster than snow on a campfire. A good leader didn't rule through fear alone. He had to feed, reward, and impress his people. That meant constant expansion. More raids, more spoils, more songs sung about how great you were at both. If your neighbors stopped raiding for a season, you got suspicious. Why are they farming so much? Was the medieval equivalent of, what's he plotting? This constant tension shaped Viking politics. It wasn't about borders or ideology, just reputation. In a world where honor mattered more than survival, a single insult could start a feud lasting generations. If someone called your cousin a liar, congratulations, you now had a family war. And then there were the kings, the ambitious few who tried to unite the chaos. Harold Fairhair, for instance, who allegedly swore not to cut or comb his hair until he ruled all of Norway. It took him years, countless battles, and a hygiene situation best left to the imagination. But he did it eventually, proving that stubbornness and split ends can change history. Yet unity came at a cost. Not everyone wanted a single ruler, especially those who'd enjoyed raiding freely without paying taxes. Many dissenters packed up their families, built ships, and left, heading west to places like Iceland and the Faroe Islands, where nobody told them what to do. These exiles became poets, traders, and lawmakers, carrying the Viking spirit of independence wherever they went. At home, the landscape remained raw and untamed. Mountains scraped the sky, forests whispered with myths, and fjords glowed silver under endless twilight. It was a place that demanded resilience, where every life felt both fragile and heroic. You couldn't farm without patience or sail without faith. Maybe that's why their stories always teetered between tragedy and triumph. But even amid the fighting and feasting, there was order. The Vikings held things, assemblies where free men gathered to settle disputes, pass laws, and argue about sheep. It was democracy with a side of sword threats. Still, it worked. It kept chaos civilized, more or less. Scandinavia may have been home, but peace was a foreign concept. The same restlessness that sent men across oceans thrived in their own backyards. For every king crowned, another rebel sharpened his axe. And so, while Europe remembered the Vikings as conquerors, the Vikings themselves remembered endless winter nights, internal feuds, and the comforting certainty that no one, not even family, could be fully trusted. So as the snow falls quietly over those northern hills, imagine the glow of firelight spilling from longhouses. Laughter mixes with shouting, songs fade into arguments. Somewhere a bard begins another saga, one that starts inevitably with, "It all began when someone insulted someone's goat." Chapter 14. Women of the North. Behind every great Viking, there was an even greater woman, often standing in the doorway, arms crossed, wondering why he'd left again without fixing the roof. Viking women didn't just stay home and wave goodbye from the fjord. They ran the show while the men were away, which was most of the time. They managed farms, oversaw trade, raised children, and made sure the family's slaves didn't accidentally sell the goats. They handled everything from finances to family feuds. In short, while men were off discovering Europe, women were discovering that everything worked fine without them. Unlike much of medieval Europe, Viking women had remarkable rights. They could own property, divorce husbands, inherit wealth, and even run businesses. If a man mistreated his wife, she could pack up, take her dowry, and leave legally. In an age when most women were considered property, the Norse system said, actually, she might be your boss. Some women even became warriors. Shield maidens, they were called. Though historians still debate how common they were, the sagas speak of fierce fighters like Lagertha, who allegedly led troops into battle while wearing armor that terrified men twice her size. Maybe not every tale was literal, but the message was clear. Underestimate a Viking woman, and you'd regret it. Daily life revolved around the longhouse, where women's work was as essential as warfare. They spun wool, dyed fabrics, brewed ale, baked bread, and crafted jewelry. These weren't small tasks. They were survival. A good wife could keep a family alive through endless winters, and that earned respect, genuine cultural respect, not the thanks for doing the dishes kind. Marriage itself was more practical than romantic. It was a business deal wrapped in mead and ceremony. But affection grew, and loyalty mattered. Runestones across Scandinavia bear inscriptions like, "He raised this stone in memory of his wife, the best of women." Simple words, but sincere ones. Even warriors who forgot to write home never forgot who ran home. Women also held power in religion. Priestesses known as vulvas acted as seers and spiritual leaders. They performed rituals, read omens, and scared the life out of anyone foolish enough to interrupt. In a world ruled by fate, these women held the keys to destiny, and occasionally, the ability to curse your crops. Archaeology tells the same story. Graves of wealthy women have been found filled with silver, keys, and fine textiles, symbols of authority and status. One famous burial in Birka, Sweden, even contained weapons and armor once assumed to belong to a man. DNA tests later revealed, nope, she was very much a woman. History, it seems, had some apologizing to do. Viking sagas also loved powerful female characters. Queens who ruled kingdoms, widows who commanded ships, mothers who plotted revenge with icy patience. They weren't background figures. They were the pulse of every legend. In many ways, the Viking world worked because its women did. So as you drift deeper into sleep, picture this. A northern farm, snow glittering in the moonlight. Inside the longhouse, a woman stirs the fire, listening to the wind whisper through the fjord. She smiles, not out of longing, but quiet pride. Her husband may be out chasing fame, but she's the one keeping the world turning. Because in the end, the sagas remembered something modern history often forgets. When the warriors are gone, it's the women who make sure there's still a home to come back to. Chapter 15. Viking Hygiene. Surprisingly, not terrible. When most people picture Vikings, they imagine towering men coated in mud, blood, and questionable life choices. Basically, medieval pirates with commitment issues. But surprise, the Vikings were clean. Well, by 9th century standards, which means they still smelled like a fish market in July. But they tried. And in the Dark Ages, trying counted for a lot. In fact, Vikings were some of the cleanest people in medieval Europe. They bathed weekly, which shocked their continental neighbors. The English even had a word for it. Saturday. From the Old Norse Laugardagur, literally washing day. Meanwhile, the average monk in France might bathe once a season, if the local river wasn't frozen or cursed. Viking hygiene wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Being well-groomed made you more respectable, more desirable, and apparently more terrifying to your enemies. Imagine you're a Saxon soldier, and the man charging at you not only has perfect braids, but also smells faintly of lavender soap. That's psychological warfare. Archaeologists have found combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and even nail cleaners in Viking graves. Yes, ear spoons. They took earwax seriously. Some were made of bone or antler, others of bronze. Functional art for the hygiene-conscious warrior. A Viking wouldn't go raiding without his grooming kit. You might forget your helmet, but not your comb. Men trimmed their beards with knives, styled their hair with animal fat, Viking hair gel, and dyed it blonde using lye soap. This wasn't just for fashion. In a world where blondness was rare, it was exotic, even divine. The sagas describe heroes with golden hair glowing in the firelight, while their enemies presumably wondered why they looked like shampoo commercials. Women, too, took pride in appearance. They wore long dresses fastened with brooches, often in bright colors. Their hair was usually braided or wrapped in scarves, and jewelry was common, not just for beauty, but to display family wealth. A well-dressed woman was a walking resume. Even the poorest Vikings cared about cleanliness. Bathhouses existed in towns like Hedeby and Birka, heated by stones and steam. Small sanctuaries where people scrubbed away sea salt and sin. And while they didn't have toothpaste, they chewed twigs from aromatic trees like birch to freshen their breath. Minty? No. Better than corpse breath? Absolutely. Interestingly, this cleanliness confused their enemies. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers wrote, often bitterly, that Viking men were too clean and therefore too attractive to women. In other words, they were furious because the Vikings bathed and stole their girlfriends. So much for divine punishment. Apparently, hygiene was the real secret weapon. Of course, not everything smelled like roses. Viking ships reeked of sweat, smoke, fish, and wet wool. Their clothes, often unwashed at sea, developed a texture somewhere between armor and regret. And yes, lice were a constant companion. But at least they faced their parasites with dignity. At home, life was a little fresher. Hearth fires filled longhouses with warmth and smoke, which, unintentionally, also disinfected them. Pine needles and herbs were sprinkled on floors for scent, and though they didn't have deodorant, they did use oils and animal fat to keep their skin from cracking in the cold. So next time you picture a Viking, don't imagine a mud-coated brute. Think of a man carefully combing his beard, humming a saga, and making sure his helmet sits just right before battle. Because conquering Europe is easier when you look good doing it. And maybe, just maybe, the secret to Viking success wasn't strength or strategy. It was self-care. Chapter 16. How to Scare a Monk in 10 Seconds. There are many ways to frighten a medieval monk. Thunderstorms, comets, loud geese. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the sound of Viking longships emerging from the mist. Imagine it. You're a peaceful monk in 9th century England. You've just finished writing a manuscript about divine mercy, and you're thinking about lunch. Suddenly, you hear something strange. Rhythmic splashes, creaking wood, the faint hum of chanting voices. You peer out the monastery window, and there they are. Sleek ships with dragon heads, their sails striped red and white, gliding silently toward shore. That's not the Holy Spirit. That's trouble. The Vikings had mastered the art of dramatic entrances. They often attacked at dawn, when fog cloaked the rivers and birds hadn't yet decided to scream. The monks would barely wake before the first axe hit the door. It was the medieval equivalent of being woken by an air horn. But what made the Vikings truly terrifying wasn't just their weapons. It was their presentation. They designed fear like artists. The dragon heads carved onto their prows weren't decoration. They were psychological warfare. The bright shields hanging along the hull shimmered in the early light, like scales of a living creature. To the terrified eyes of villagers, the ships looked like monsters gliding over the water. And then came the sound. The deep, synchronized beat of oars striking water, the chant of men timing their strokes, the low bellow of horns echoing through valleys. Even birds fled. It wasn't an army approaching. It was doom, with excellent rhythm. Once ashore, the raiders moved fast. They knew monasteries were undefended and full of treasure. Not just gold, but books, wine, and finely crafted metalwork. And because monks tended to panic instead of fight, it was like robbing a very apologetic bank. But to the Vikings, it wasn't evil, it was efficiency. They didn't hate Christianity, they just loved portable wealth. They looted, burned, left, and sometimes even returned to the same place a year later, treating it like a seasonal shopping trip. Back to Lindisfarne, someone probably said. Their candles are lovely. For Europe, this was trauma. Chroniclers wrote that lightning, earthquakes, and Viking ships were all signs of God's anger. But for the Vikings, it was Tuesday. Yet amid the horror, there was an odd sort of mutual fascination. Some monks, after surviving attacks, actually joined the Vikings as scribes or translators. Others recorded their captors' customs with reluctant admiration, noting their bravery, discipline, and the fact that they bathed more than anyone else they knew. And to be fair, the Vikings didn't always kill. Many monasteries learned the art of negotiation. If you handed over your valuables quickly and said nice ships, they'd usually leave you alive. A rough but practical version of diplomacy. But there's a deeper reason their arrival terrified people so profoundly. Unpredictability. They weren't part of Europe's system. They didn't follow the church, the kings, or the rules of war. They came from nowhere and vanished just as suddenly. They were the embodiment of chaos in a world that worshipped order. So as you picture those dragon-proud ships gliding through the mist, remember, it wasn't just violence that made them legendary. It was the aura, the drama, the sense that the sea itself had decided to declare war. And as the night deepens, imagine that soft mist rolling over calm water. The oars fall silent. The sails drop. The dragons sleep once more. Somewhere in the distance, a monk exhales and whispers a prayer of thanks. Because this time, the sound of the sea was just the wind. Chapter 17. From looters to landlords. Every party has to end eventually. Even a 2-century-long one involving axes and mead. By the late 900s, the Vikings were changing. The same men who once shouted battle cries across rivers now found themselves yelling at sheep instead. The raiders were becoming residents. It didn't happen overnight. At first, settling down was a matter of convenience. Winter camps became villages, trade posts became towns, and before anyone noticed, entire families were planting crops instead of pillaging them. It was the world's slowest rebrand, from chaos merchants to respectable taxpayers. The truth is, raiding was exhausting. You could only burn so many monasteries before realizing that stolen gold doesn't grow wheat. You still needed food, homes, and someone to wash your clothes after a year at sea. So when they found fertile land in England, Ireland, and France, many Vikings decided to stay. They built wooden halls, fenced pastures, and even learned the deeply un-Viking art of patience. Trade replaced terror. Markets blossomed in former war zones. Furs, amber, and weapons were swapped for wine, salt, and silk. A Viking merchant might travel from Dublin to Baghdad, speaking 5 languages and lying fluently in all of them. Silver coins replaced plundered chalices, and haggling replaced raiding, though both involved shouting. But the shift wasn't just economic, it was emotional. For generations raised on sagas of blood and glory, the idea of peace felt suspicious. You could sense it at the hearth. Men stirring soup with the same intensity they once used to stab things, struggling to find meaning in a quieter life. They were warriors learning to sit still. Many took up craftsmanship, shipbuilding, metalwork, carving. A good swordsmith was as respected as any fighter, and artisans began signing their work with runes, proud of creating beauty instead of destruction. Viking art flourished, intricate knots, dragons, and animals twisting together in endless patterns, as if even decoration couldn't sit calmly in one direction. Social life evolved too. The old gatherings, the things, became formal assemblies of law and governance. Disputes were settled with silver fines instead of swords. In some regions, even women gained a voice in these councils, a concept so modern it made neighboring kingdoms very uncomfortable. Religion, however, remained stubbornly pagan for a while. Odin, Thor, and Freya still ruled the hearts of many. But missionaries crept north, bringing promises of eternal peace and slightly less demanding gods. At first, the Vikings were unimpressed. "You're telling me there's a heaven with no mead and no axe practice?" Hard pass. Yet as trade with Christian Europe deepened, conversion became good business. And so, by the dawn of the 11th century, the Viking Age of raiding quietly faded into the age of settlement. The dragons on the prows were carved smaller. The axes grew dull. Children born in the Danelaw or Normandy no longer dreamed of the sea. They dreamed of inheritance, taxes, and decent roofs. Still, the old instincts never disappeared entirely. You can't erase a culture of courage and curiosity in a single generation. Every farm built near the water kept one small boat ready, just in case the horizon whispered again. Because somewhere deep inside, every Viking knew, the sea always calls back. And so they stayed, prospered, and planted the seeds of something new, the kingdoms that would later shape Europe itself. The looters had become landlords, and history, always ironic, applauded their civilizing influence. Chapter 18. The Viking Rebrand. It's one thing to stop raiding, it's another to reinvent your entire reputation. And somehow, the Vikings managed both, with a grace that can only be described as suspiciously efficient. By the early 1000s, the Viking world had traded its thunder for diplomacy. Where once they arrived uninvited with torches, they now arrived with treaties, marriages, and firm handshakes. They'd gone corporate. The driving force behind this transformation? Christianity and, of course, marketing. Missionaries from the South preached peace, forgiveness, and the radical notion that you didn't have to die heroically to go to heaven. At first, the Vikings laughed. Then they realized that joining the church came with perks: literacy, legitimacy, and fewer enemies. One by one, kings converted. Harold Bluetooth of Denmark famously proclaimed himself Christian around 965. Proof that even the man who invented wireless communication with God needed a good PR stunt. He built churches, minted coins with crosses, and politely reminded everyone that he'd once burned half of England. It was redemption, Viking style. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason took conversion more personally. He stormed through the country, baptizing people at sword point. "You'll thank me later," he probably said, while dunking terrified farmers into freezing rivers. Spiritual enlightenment came with mild hypothermia, but beneath the zeal was pragmatism. Christian kings could now sign alliances with Europe's great powers. Trade flowed more freely. Silver replaced plunder as the measure of success, and priests, clever, persistent priests, began writing down Norse stories, freezing their oral sagas in ink before they vanished into memory. Ironically, this Christianization preserved the very pagan myths it sought to replace. Without monks transcribing them, we might never have known of Odin's wanderings, Thor's hammer, or Loki's mischievous chaos. In saving the Vikings' souls, Europe accidentally saved their imagination. Culturally, the shift was enormous. Church bells replaced war horns. Stone cathedrals rose where wooden temples once stood. Instead of sacrificing goats, people sacrificed their patience during long sermons. Old gods faded into folklore, living on in fairy tales and in the occasional nervous glance sailors gave before a storm. And yet, something of the old spirit survived. Even baptized Vikings never lost their edge. Their Christianity was pragmatic, adaptable, half-cross, half-hammer pendant, tucked discreetly under the tunic. If one god didn't answer prayers, there was always a backup. By the 11th century, Scandinavia had fully joined the European family, as cousins with an interesting past. They sent ambassadors instead of armies, exported fish instead of fear, and started arguing about trade tariffs instead of theology. The age of exploration loomed, and the same daring that once fueled raids now built ships bound for new worlds. It's strange, really. The people who had once terrified Europe now helped shape it. They gave it new kings, new trade routes, new languages. They were still Vikings at heart, just better dressed, better educated, and slightly less on fire. So as you settle deeper into sleep, imagine a Viking king sitting in a candlelit hall. On one side of him, a silver cross. On the other, a carved hammer of Thor. He smiles, content, knowing that somehow, against all odds, his people have conquered the world not just with steel, but with transformation. Outside, the wind hums through the fjord, half hymn, half battle song, because even when the raiding stopped, the rhythm of the North never did. Chapter 19, Kings of the Frozen North. By the time the year 1000 rolled around, the Vikings had done it all. Conquered, settled, converted, and occasionally complained about how expensive everything had become. But one thing still eluded them. Unity. For centuries, the North had been a patchwork quilt of clans and egos stitched together with blood and ale. Now, new kings rose from that chaos, ambitious, cunning, and determined to rule not just one fjord, but everything they could see from the highest mountain. First came Harald Fairhair, Norway's poster boy for commitment issues. He swore not to cut or comb his hair until he became king of all Norway. It took about 10 years, several wars, and probably a few lice infestations, but he did it. When he finally brushed his glorious mane, he had unified a nation and accidentally invented the concept of royal hair care. Then came Swine Forkbeard, whose name suggests a man who lost a duel with a fork, but was, in fact, Denmark's greatest king. Sweyn ruled with sharp wit and sharper steel. He led raids across Europe, dethroned kings, and even took England for himself, proving that if you annoy enough monarchs, eventually one of them will retire just to make it stop. But it was his son, Canute the Great, who truly changed the game. Born to a Viking father and a Polish mother, Canute ruled like a man who'd read the manual for empire building twice. By 1028, he controlled Denmark, Norway, and England, a northern empire so vast that even Odin might have paused mid-mead to take notes. Canute wasn't just a conqueror. He was a politician with patience. He balanced Christian and pagan traditions, kept trade flowing, and turned his violent heritage into stable governance. He even ordered roads repaired and churches built, an unthinkable act for a Viking leader a century earlier. His people called him Canute the Great, not because he fought the hardest, but because he finally figured out how to run the place without setting it on fire. There's a famous story about him that perfectly captures his legend. One day, his courtiers flattered him, saying he was so powerful even the sea obeyed him. To prove them wrong, Canute had his throne placed on the beach. As the tide rolled in, he raised his hand and commanded the waves to stop. The sea ignored him, of course, soaking his royal boots. Canute smiled and said, "See, even a king must know his limits." It was a rare moment of royal humility, or possibly sarcasm, depending on how damp he was. While Canute ruled, Scandinavia prospered. Trade routes stretched from the North Sea to Constantinople. Merchants carried amber, iron, and furs south, returning with silk, spices, and stories of strange, warm lands where the sun didn't vanish for half the year. The Viking world, once isolated, now hummed with global energy. But empires are like bonfires, glorious for a while, then destined to fade. After Canute's death in 1035, his realm splintered. Rival heirs fought for crowns, borders blurred, and the familiar northern chaos returned like an old drinking buddy. Still, something had changed forever. Scandinavia was no longer the wild edge of the world. It was a cornerstone of it. As night falls over this chapter, picture the flicker of torches along a royal hall, kings and warriors feasting under carved beams, the air thick with laughter and smoke. Outside, the sea murmurs softly, as if reminding them, kingdoms rise, kings fall, but the waves remain. Chapter 20. Crossing the Atlantic for fun and profit. The Viking hunger for discovery didn't end with crowns and castles. No, it just needed a new horizon. When there were no more monasteries left to raid, someone inevitably looked west and said, "Hey, what's over there?" And so began the greatest adventure of all, the voyages to the edge of the world. The first stops were nearby. The Faroe Islands, small, green, and full of confused sheep. Then came Iceland, discovered in the late 800s by settlers fleeing Norwegian politics, overbearing kings, or perhaps just in-laws. They arrived to find a land of volcanoes, hot springs, and not much else. But it was free, and freedom was the Vikings' favorite currency. Iceland became a haven for outcasts and poets, for dreamers and farmers who preferred lava to taxes. No kings ruled there, only assemblies, laws, and endless arguments about cows. It was democracy powered by stubbornness and fermented milk. But even Iceland wasn't far enough for some. Adventurers like Eric the Red, a man with the personality of a storm, cloud, sailed further west and discovered Greenland. He named it Greenland as a marketing strategy, hoping it would attract settlers. It worked somehow, even though it was mostly white and frozen. Eric's sales pitch might be history's first real estate scam. Greenland's settlements clung to the coasts, where hardy Norse families built farms, hunted seals, and wondered if maybe Snowland would have been a more honest name. They traded walrus tusks and polar bear skins, thriving for a while despite the cold's best efforts to murder them. And then came the boldest voyage of all, Vinland, the mysterious land across the sea. According to sagas, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, set sail around the year 1000 and reached the coast of North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus would get all the credit. Leif and his crew described forests, wild grapes, and animals unlike any they'd seen. They built temporary camps, explored rivers, and decided wisely that the locals were not in the mood for visitors. Vinland was brief, a whisper of what could have been, but the fact that they got there at all is extraordinary. Without compasses, maps, or GPS, they crossed an unforgiving ocean using the stars, sunstones, and instinct. Every creak of the hull was a gamble, every gust of wind a prayer. It was courage and curiosity at their purest form, the final echo of that ancient Viking restlessness. Though the settlements in Greenland and Vinland eventually vanished, the legend remained. The north had reached the west, and somewhere, in a smoky longhouse, a storyteller likely leaned in and said, "Beyond the sea lies a land of endless trees. But don't go there. They throw spears." These western voyages marked the end of an era. The Vikings had touched almost every corner of the known world, from Baghdad's bazaars to North America's forests. They'd been warriors, traders, kings, and poets. They'd terrified Europe and then taught it how to sail. And now they'd found something rarer than gold, the horizon's edge. So as the wind hums softly through your imagination, picture a Viking ship drifting west under the northern lights. The sea glows like molten glass, the oars rest, and the sailors gaze at stars brighter than belief. They don't know what waits beyond, only that they're going. Because for them, and perhaps for all of us, the unknown was always worth the journey. Chapter 21. Life in the settlements, when the sails were finally furled and the axes hung up. Viking life found a quieter rhythm. The same hands that once gripped oars and weapons now sowed seeds, built fences, and traded goods. It was the dawn of a new kind of adventure, one that required patience, not plunder. In Iceland, Greenland, and across the Danelaw of England, the descendants of raiders became settlers, farmers, and storytellers. They still lived close to the sea. They could never fully trust the land, but their hearts began to belong to it. Fields of barley replaced battlefields. The sounds of clashing steel gave way to the creak of cartwheels and the chatter of markets. A Viking village was a humble yet lively place. Longhouses stretched like sleeping beasts, built from timber and turf. Smoke curled through roof holes, carrying the smell of wood, stew, and wet wool. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs dozed by the fire. Inside, families gathered around the hearth, the heart of every home, where heat, stories, and gossip all burned together. Children learned early that survival was teamwork. They fetched water, tended animals, and practiced throwing sticks that would one day become spears. Girls spun wool and memorized the family sagas. Boys carved wood and memorized excuses. No one was idle, but life wasn't joyless. They sang, danced, wrestled, and told tales deep into the endless northern nights. Trade became the lifeblood of the settlements. Ships carried furs, amber, and soapstone south, bringing back silver, wine, and news of foreign kings. Markets bustled with noise, Norse, Saxon, Gaelic, and even Arabic mixing together in a linguistic stew that somehow worked. Coins jingled where once swords had clashed. Society, too, was structured but flexible. At the top stood the chieftains, men of wealth and charisma who ruled by respect more than law. Below them, free farmers worked their own land, proud, and independent. Then came the thralls, enslaved people, captured in raids or born into servitude. Yet even here, freedom was possible. Thralls could earn or buy their release, and some rose to positions of trust and wealth. It was a hard world, but not a hopeless one. Religion still lingered in the corners. Old gods lived quietly beside the new. A Christian cross might hang beside a hammer of Thor, because one could never be too careful. On feast days, villagers gathered for drinking, singing, and what might generously be described as competitive storytelling. And every toast ended with the same wish: Skål, to health, fortune, and maybe one more refill. The sagas that later preserved these stories were born in this age of peace. Tales of heroes, monsters, and long journeys were written not by warriors, but by their grandchildren, people who'd traded blood for ink. In these stories, the sea still roared, but from a safe distance. The adventures had become memories, and the memories, mythology. There's something beautiful about that shift. The same people who once lived for action learned to live for meaning. They found poetry in the ordinary, the way frost glitters on a roof at dawn, or how a child's laughter echoes down a frozen fjord. Their world was still harsh, but now it had warmth, not from conquest, but from connection. So imagine it, a quiet Viking village under the northern lights. The fires glow, the wind hums through the valley, and somewhere, a storyteller begins. Long ago, before we settled here, we sailed the seas, and everyone, young and old, leans closer, not to remember war, but to remember wonder. Chapter 22. The slow fade of the Viking Age. Every age ends the same way, not with a bang, but with a sigh. And so it was with the Vikings. No single battle, no sudden collapse, just time, gently erasing the sharp edges of their story. By the 11th century, Europe had changed beyond recognition. The kingdoms that once trembled now stood firm, fortified with stone walls and standing armies. The church had spread its influence far and wide, promising salvation and standardized guilt in equal measure. And the once feared Vikings. They had become part of the furniture. Trade routes replaced raid routes. Where longships once carried warriors, they now carried merchants, pilgrims, and the occasional missionary arguing about fasting days. Towns like York, Dublin, and Rouen, once Viking strongholds, blossomed into thriving medieval cities. Their street names, crafts, and accents still whispered of the North, even as their churches rang with southern bells. The new generation of Scandinavians grew up hearing stories of the old days the way we hear fairy tales, exciting, distant, slightly implausible. The young farmers laughed at the idea of crossing oceans for silver when there was enough barley to harvest at home. They wore crosses instead of hammer pendants, wrote letters instead of carving runes, and dreamed of trade, not terror. But the spirit of exploration never truly died. It simply evolved. The same curiosity that once sent longships west would later send ships south, to Africa, to Asia, to the unknown corners of the world. The Vikings had taught humanity a dangerous lesson, that the horizon is not a wall, but a doorway. Still, nostalgia lingered. Old men would sit by the fire, stroking their beards and beginning sentences with, "In my day, we didn't have taxes. We took them." Children would roll their eyes, the way children always do, unaware that they were living in the echoes of legend. Archaeologists call it the end of the Viking Age, around the year 1066. Fittingly, the year another descendant of the North, William the Conqueror, invaded England. It was the final curtain call, a Viking by blood, now dressed in French silk, riding a horse instead of a longship. History loves irony, but maybe the Viking Age never truly ended. It just went quiet. Its legacy seeped into everything: law, language, literature, and even modern imagination. Every time someone builds, explores, or dares to try something ridiculous because why not? A little Viking spark flares again. The world they left behind was warmer, brighter, and infinitely more connected, in part because they had refused to stay put. The same restless energy that once terrified Europe had pushed it forward. So, as the waves of history rolled on, the chaos and roar of the longships faded into the lull of the sea. The dragons slept, the oars fell still, and the men of the north, fierce, flawed, and human, became part of the great dream of time. And if you listen closely, very closely, to the wind on a quiet night, you might still hear them. That faint rhythm of oars, the creak of timber, the hum of distant voices carried over the dark water. It isn't a threat anymore. It's a lullaby. Chapter 23: Myths, Legends, and Bad History Channel Dramatizations. The Viking Age may have ended, but the stories refused to. They lingered in songs, in sagas, in the smoky corners of longhouses where someone always said, "Once upon a time." And as the centuries rolled on, those tales grew taller than the tallest fjord. Reality blurred. The muddy, frost-bitten farmer who once grumbled about taxes became a fearless warrior with the power of thunder in his beard. The practical, sea-tired sailor became a demigod who conquered storms with a single shout. Time, as it always does, polished every scar until it gleamed like heroism. We like our heroes larger than life, and the Vikings, conveniently, were already halfway there. In the retelling, they gained muscles, lost morals, and somehow all acquired perfect teeth. They were no longer human. They were cinematic. Of course, they didn't start out that way. The Icelandic sagas, written centuries after the events they describe, were part history, part gossip, part soap opera. They told of feuds, forbidden love, shipwrecks, and ghosts. Every hero was brave, every villain poetic, and everyone had suspiciously good memory for long speeches delivered in snowstorms. One saga tells of Grettir the Strong, a man so tough he once fought a ghost and complained it wasn't challenging enough. Another recounts Egil Skallagrimsson, a poet warrior who could compose verses while murdering his enemies. The Norse version of multitasking. These stories weren't history. They were therapy. They helped people make sense of a world that had once been violent and uncertain. Turning trauma into epic poetry is, after all, the oldest coping mechanism. But as time went on, the Vikings escaped their own sagas. They sailed into art, into nationalism, and eventually into television. By the 19th century, European artists painted them as noble, blonde giants gazing tragically at the sea. Romantics loved them. Strong, passionate, misunderstood. It was the historical equivalent of giving your ex a heroic backstory. Then came the 20th century, when Hollywood discovered that Viking was a word that sold tickets. Suddenly, every Viking wore horned helmets, a myth invented by 19th century costume designers who apparently thought historical accuracy sounded boring. Real Vikings never wore horns. It's hard to raid efficiently when your hat keeps catching door frames. But the image stuck. Even today, cartoons, video games, and streaming shows still give them horns, eyeliner, and suspiciously modern haircuts. They drink mead from skulls, shout "Skull" every 5 minutes, and apparently spend all their free time flexing in slow motion. And you know what? That's okay. Because even if the details are wrong, the feeling is right. The mythic Viking, fearless, curious, defiant, still captures something real about the human spirit. They remind us that life is meant to be lived boldly, that the sea is still calling, and that somewhere deep inside, we all want to believe we could row toward the horizon and survive it. So maybe the sagas never lied. They just told emotional truth. They weren't about what happened, but about what it felt like to live in that cold, beautiful, impossible world. To stand against the wind and laugh. As the fire in your mind's eye burns low, imagine those old storytellers again. Their faces glow orange in the hearthlight, their voices slow and rich. Outside, the northern night stretches endlessly, filled with ghosts, gods, and memory, and someone whispers the question that keeps them awake and dreaming. Do you think they'll remember us like this? Chapter 24, What the Vikings Left Behind. When you strip away the myth, the dragons, the helmets, the thunder gods, what remains of the Vikings? Quite a lot, actually. Their story may have ended 1,000 years ago, but their fingerprints are still all over modern life. Start with language. If you speak English, you already speak a little Old Norse every day. Words like sky, egg, window, knife, husband, anger, law, and wrong, all gifts from the north. Even Thursday comes from Thor's day. So every week, when you're stuck in traffic, you can quietly blame a Viking god. They also left their mark on law and government. Their thing, a public assembly where free men debated and made decisions, was one of the earliest forms of democracy in Europe. Modern parliaments trace their roots back to those gatherings on windy hillsides where people argued about sheep, land, and whose goat started the fight. Freedom of speech, it turns out, has ancient Nordic origins, shouted loudly over ale. Their engineering changed the world too. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of design, light, flexible, and fast. Its influence echoes in shipbuilding for centuries after. Even today, naval architects admire its balance and symmetry. It was less a vessel and more a philosophy. If the world is vast, build something that can take you there. Culturally, they stitched Europe together. Through trade and travel, they connected distant lands, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. They carried stories, goods, and ideas across borders long before passports were invented. They were globalists before globalization had a name. In art, their legacy lives on in patterns that twist and coil like living vines, intricate designs that decorate churches, jewelry, and tattoos to this day. Their carvings blended beasts, gods, and geometry into one endless knot, as if they were trying to explain infinity without using words. Even in death, the Vikings shaped memory. Burial mounds still dot the northern landscapes, quiet humps of earth overlooking fjords and fields. Inside them lie ships, swords, beads, and bones, silent reminders that even raiders dreamed of eternity. Some graves hold men, others women, some both. Because legend doesn't always fit into neat categories. Their spirit also lives on in something harder to measure: curiosity. The willingness to sail into fog, to risk everything for something unseen. That instinct built not only empires, but imagination. It taught humanity to ask, what lies beyond? And to keep asking, even when the sea answers only with silence. And perhaps most importantly, they left behind stories. Not just the sagas, but the human stories woven through them, of love and loss, courage and stupidity, pride and laughter. Stories that say, we were here, we mattered, We dreamed big, and we made a mess of it, but at least we tried. So tonight, as you sit here centuries later, safe and warm, listening to echoes of that faraway world, know that you're part of it too. Because history isn't gone. It just keeps whispering through us, like the wind through the sails of an ancient ship. And maybe, if you close your eyes and listen carefully, you'll hear it. The creak of wood, the hush of waves, and the faint, eternal call of the north saying, "Come see what's over the horizon." Chapter 25. Good night from the north, hey. You made it. We've sailed together through storms and sagas, through kingdoms and chaos, through centuries of ice and iron. And now, at last, the sea has gone still. The oars rest. The horizon has stopped moving. The story of the Vikings isn't really about war or gold. It's about that small, restless spark inside every person, the one that whispers, "There's more out there." For them, that whisper became wind in the sails. For us, it's something quieter, a dream, a question, a heartbeat that still remembers the ocean. Picture the world they left behind. The northern lights shimmer softly above sleeping villages. The longhouses are dark, the fires burned low. Snow drifts against doorways. Somewhere, a dog sighs in its sleep, and on a distant fjord, an old ship creaks gently against its moorings, as if remembering all the miles it has seen. In those halls, storytellers still sit by the embers. They speak of gods and giants, of kings and wanderers, of lovers waiting by the sea. But their voices grow slower, quieter, because even legends get tired. Outside, the wind hums through the pine trees, carrying the last echo of an age when people believed the world could be crossed in a single lifetime. The Vikings are gone now, folded back into time. Their swords lie rusted beneath moss and soil. Their names, once shouted over battlefields, have become murmurs in history books. And yet, in every explorer, every builder, every dreamer who looks at a blank map and thinks why not, they live on. They are the part of us that doesn't sit still. So close your eyes. Hear the waves brush softly against the shore. Feel the cool breath of the north slide through your imagination. The journey is over, but the sea is still here, patient, eternal, waiting for the next story. Let the darkness cradle you like a longship at rest. Let the stars above you be the same ones that guided them home. And as you drift into sleep, remember what they taught. That courage isn't loud, and adventure isn't always found on maps. Sometimes it's simply the act of dreaming with your eyes closed. Good night from the north. The oars are silent now. The sea is calm, and tomorrow, when the sun rises over the frozen waves, another story will begin, softly, somewhere beyond the horizon.